I write about whiskey. If you don't mind, I'm going to do this in English. Is that okay? Yeah? Or Scottish, to be more precise. I'll do it in Scottish. Occasionally, I'll speak in English as well. Over the next wee while, what I will talk about is peat, and not just peat, but smoke in general. There's a real trend around the world for loving smoky whiskies, and it's a trend that shows no sign of slowing down. I think it used to be thought that, and I remember this back in the early days when the classic malts were launched in the 1990s, it was thought that everybody, or the vast majority of drinkers, would gravitate towards Glenkinchie. Glenkinchie was going to be the big brand for Diageo. Only mad fools would drink Lagavulin because it's just too difficult. It was weird, it's smoky. And of course, the exact opposite happened. And people began to gravitate towards smoky whiskies rather than the lighter, more gentle style. There's a whole number of reasons for that. And I think one of the main reasons for me is that, well, two reasons. People like smoke. We're hardwired to like smoke. It reminds us of home. It reminds us of danger, but also reminds us of home in a strange way. And also, it is easily identifiable. So if you're starting out on your whiskey journey and you have a glass of smoky whiskey in front of you and you don't really have a language for whiskey, and you pick up this glass, you can go, it's smoky. You immediately attach a word to it. And because you attach a word to it, you become more confident about your own ability to taste. So I think that's a lot to do with people coming into smoky whiskies and actually over time then going into more lighter and more delicate and more subtle whiskies as well. So, hey, just a theory, but disprove it if you want. What is peat? Well, this is peat. This man's name is Peat. No, this is the Tolland man. The Tolland man, who's dead, obviously, was found in a peat bog in Denmark. So you find remarkable stuff in peat bogs. You find bits of tree. You find bodies occasionally. So far, no bodies have turned up in Scotland, but there's the Tolland man. So, this is kind of what we're going to be looking at over the next wee while. What is peat? How is it used? I want to kind of explode a few myths, I think, that creep up about smoke and peaty stuff. And probably not that how to use smoke and drinks bit, because this is actually a presentation I did for bartenders, so ignore that bit. The man here is Norrie Campbell, or Norrie Kimball, who was the last professional peat cutter on Islay, and also a DJ. He had a travelling disco. It didn't travel very far. It only travelled between Portellen and Bowmore. But yeah, he was a DJ as well. Norrie, who sadly died a few years back, taught my mother how to cut peat on her 80th birthday. There you go. I'm proud of my mother and of Norrie Kimball. Okay, so enough of that. Let's get on to taking a little bit of science. What is peat? Well, peat is semi-carbonized vegetation. It is vegetation which is held in waterlogged conditions, so it doesn't fully decompose. So there's no oxygen in there. Waterlogged conditions, hard bedrock as well. All the vegetation gets compressed down, turns into peat. If there's under different conditions, we turn into lignite and then turn into coal. So it's kind of like baby coal, but not quite. But you have to have these heavy waterlogged conditions for all that vegetation just to sit and slowly kind of rot and begin to compress. And that's the important thing. Where do we find peat? Well, in Scotland, obviously. But it's interesting to see where peat is around the world. Huge swathe of kind of northern Europe, all across Siberia, There's even some in Rwanda. Then obviously in the East Indies here, Tasmania's got some as well. There's bits and pieces all across there. So geological conditions will dictate that peat forms. This in itself is fascinating because you'll begin to see the potential for making a smoky whiskey or a peated whiskey doesn't just exist in Scotland and Ireland. But you could, in theory, make a peaty whiskey in Rwanda with Rwandan peat. And they are making peaty whiskey in Tasmania using Tasmanian peat. And the west coast of America, just in here around about Seattle, Westland, have got fantastic smoky whiskey using their local peat as well. Might as well address this one question since we're kind of talking about the wide expanse of peat that's covering such a vast amount of the Earth's surface. It helps to lock in carbon. You don't want peat fires. You don't want to dig up too much peat because it is locking in carbon. So the Scotch whisky industry, and I think all the whisky industries are using peat in actually very small quantities and are finding much more efficient ways to manage this precious resource because the planet is burning. We can talk about any questions, just we can touch on that in a wee while. So before we get on to our, let's just pick up our first glass. So glass number 1. Glass number 1, let me warn you, before you take a hefty sip, is 59.9% ABV, okay? So that's very precise. It's 60%, okay? So this is not a shy whiskey. This is a big, strong beast of a dram. So just get your nose into the glass. I'd recommend you add a little drops of water. Take a taste if you want. If it's too hot, add some water. Yeah. Which glass would be number 1? Yeah. Sorry, bottom left. That's it. Yeah. See. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, sorry. See, I have staff, I don't do this. I don't pour whiskey, I get carried in here. Right. So yeah, get your nose into the glass, and we'll just have a little chat around it as you kind of familiarise yourself, nose and taste it. How do you make a peaty whiskey? Well, it's relatively straightforward. You find it to begin with. So you go out and you find your peat bank, and once you find your peat bank, you cut it. This is Ian MacArthur, Pinky MacArthur, from Lagavulin. So he's been working at Lagavulin for almost 50 years. He's a crofter as well, so he has his own peat banks that he uses for his house, actually, for his own particular use. So if you actually go back here, what you can see is the way that the peat has been cut. So this top turf is taken off, and that is put down on the ground, and the roots there will bind to the vegetation below, and everything will start to grow again. Peat kind of grows, or a peat bank builds, about 1 millimeter per year. So what you're cutting here, you're cutting back into time. You're cutting it back in thousands of years. That's probably 2,000 years once you get to the bottom of that peat bank. So when people say that we have a 10-year-old whiskey, well, the cask was probably 100 years old. It's coming from a tree that was 100 years old, and the peat might be 1,000 years old. So, the age of a whiskey is can be interpreted in a whole number of different ways. But this top peat here is very important. The top peat has got more kind of roots in it. It's quite stringy. And we'll come to why that is important for whiskey in a little second. So you cut that first one off, take it off, and then you can see there's another cut down here. And that second layer of peat, the bottom peat, is much more compressed, much more dense, and gives off very good heat. And that is what you'll be using to heat your house, rather than what you'll be using to smoke your whiskey. So you found it. You've got somebody to cut it. It needs to be dried. And then you set it on fire. It's as simple as that, really. So that's Highland Park. So that's the guys working very hard at Highland Park, you can tell. And that's the kiln at Highland Park. I don't know if you can see that very well, but there's smoke coming off. You need smoke to make a peaty whiskey. You don't need heat. You don't need flame. You will see lots of photographs and websites and marketing material that show a roaring peat fire because photographers love it because it looks fantastic. That's the last thing you want if you're making a smoky whiskey. What you want is the smoke itself, because contained within the smoke are things like that. This is a family of chemicals called phenols. You've probably heard the term phenolic parts per million. We'll touch on that in a second. So a whole bunch of this family of chemicals banded together as phenols. And you can see that each of those has a slightly different flavor or aromatic property to it. That comes from the smoke itself. So what you've done is you've malted your barley. Your barley is still damp, so it's coming out of the malting drum, and you're putting it in the kiln to dry it. It's at that point that you then light your peat fire, because the barley is still wet. So the smoke rises, and these compounds, these phenols, which are oils, will stick to the surface of the barley. And that is what will be giving your barley its smoky characteristic. Once the barley is completely dry, you don't need to burn any more peat because it won't get any smokier. It has to be when the barley is still wet. So it's before what they call the strike point in the barley. So the peat goes on first. Lots of smoke. The more smoke, the more phenols you're going to rise. But you'll only be able to drive it up to a certain level. You won't be able to just keep burning peat. You're just wasting energy. And that's one way that the industry is being very good at managing peat. Rather than throwing on big lumps of peat, it might be ground down into a finer powder. Finer powder will still give you all the smoke, but you'll use less peat. So that's one way to get around that. So let's have a little look at this whiskey number one. I often do this. I begin talking, I forget about this bloody whiskey in front of you. Okay, so let's think about the smoke here. How would you describe this? For me, it's quite dry. It's quite a kind of drying smoke. It's more of a kind of wood smoke element. It's a bit like, if you've been sitting around a fire, like a campfire or a barbecue, one night, and you've gone to bed, and you've woken up the next morning, and you've smelt maybe yourself, or you've smelt your clothing. It's got that kind of wood smoke, that lingering, quite dry, woody aroma is coming through. It is strong, so be careful when you take a little taste. And I think you get that on the palate. Slightly kind of nutty element, this kind of real kind of smouldering quality. It's like a fire that's just been lit and the smoke is kind of coming off this wood fire. And that, for me, it immediately kind of transports you to a place. The great thing about whiskey is it does transport you to a place or with people or a certain season or something. You shut your eyes, you taste that, boom, you are outdoors, you're sitting around the campfire with friends, etc. I am going to add some water to this. In a kind of wildly cavalier fashion, add some water. That's my bartending technique, the backhand water pour. It's often worthwhile, it's always worthwhile adding, I would always add water to whiskey when I'm nosing and tasting, because water helps to open the whiskey up. It reveals secrets, and it reveals flaws as well, so it's an important thing to do. And with smoke, it's very interesting what happens when you add water to a smoky whiskey. It can help to ignite the smoke. You think it would put the fire out, it actually helps the smoke to come out. So this, with the water in it, you can get much closer to it. A little more sweetness is beginning to come through. It actually doesn't need that much water. It's a very well-balanced whiskey. The water just helps it, takes away that little bit of heat. and much more rounded, slight touch of vanilla coming through. It is bourbon cask matured. And that lovely lingering smoke. So the smoke for me, once you add the water, seems to come further back on the palate, so you're getting more of a kind of smoky finish coming in there. So that is Belechin. So Belechin, which is Edredauer's smoky variant. So it's from the central part of Scotland. Now, it's at this point that somebody quite often puts their hand up and says, Dave, what is the ppm of this whiskey? ppm stands for phenolic parts per million, or, as I like to think, potential phenolic mix-up. Distillers are very good at sort of saying this ppm, you know, this is 100, this is 50, this is 70, whatever, giving you numbers. Ignore them. They mean nothing. The ppm level is what the maltster gives to the distiller. The distiller will say, I want a peated barley at 50 ppm. That is their technical term. The maltster will deliver 50 ppm. They'll measure that. But what's going to happen when you take that barley into the distillery? You're going to grind it up. All of that smoke is really contained on the husk. It doesn't penetrate all that far into the grain at all. It's going to be ground up. You're going to put it in a mash tun. You're going to mash. What's going to happen to all those husks? They're not staying in the whiskey. They're being fed to the cattle. So you lose phenols all the way through the whiskey-making process. You lose it in mashing. You will lose some in fermentation. And you will lose a huge number of phenols in your distillation. Because phenols are really heavy elements, really heavy elements within a distillate. They come across very late when you're distilling. They're mostly held in faints. So if you wanted to get all those phenols out, you would have this really disgusting fainty whiskey. It wouldn't taste very nice. So you're losing phenols all the way. But for some reason, the whiskey industry just loves to have a number attached to it. So they'll say, well, this whiskey is 50 ppm, but it's not, because when you actually taste it as a new make spirit, those phenols will have dropped down to maybe 10%. So don't be distracted by the numbers. Okay? And yeah, we might sort of, that's Kalila. That's just a nice photo. And here's the other one. Still, you don't really hear this anymore, but certainly when I started writing about whiskey, I was still being told this by distillers or by marketing departments that, oh, the water here is really peaty, you know, and that comes through in the whiskey. No, it doesn't. If that was the case, if you went to, how many of you have been to Islay? Okay, if you've been to Islay, you know, have you seen what the colour of the water in Islay is? You know, it's brown. You know, you run a bath, you think you've run a cup of tea. You know, if the water was smoky, every time you had a bath or had a shower, you would come out smelling smoky. Every time you had a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, the coffee or the tea would be smoky. Is it? No. Peaty water has got nothing to do with delivering smokiness. The compounds in there may have a contributing factor to some flavors created during fermentation, but it's not going to give you smoke. So if anybody tells you that, dismiss them immediately. Let's have a look at glass number 2. And if you've got anything left in your, of course you have, you're well behaved. No, you haven't. You've drunk one. If you have anything left, even the dry glass of number 1, compare glass 1 and glass 2. We'll talk about glass 2. This also is Scotch whiskey. What's the smoke like? Smoke here, for me, it's quite difficult to do this when you're also holding a microphone. More marine, more kind of seaweedy, more earthy. Less of that wood smoke element coming through. A bit more cask influence as well. This also is relatively strong, it's about 50%. This is Kilchoman. It's not about 50%, it is 50%. Take a taste, and again, on that first sip, really kind of concentrate on the smoke. Where does the smoke appear in your palate? Is it at the beginning? Is it in the middle? Is it at the end? Does it get more intense? A little bit on the tip of the tongue. It's quite sweet on the tip of the tongue. Then it just builds and builds and builds and builds. So when you exhale, wow, you're like a dragon. Boom, the smoke coming out of your mouth. But you've got that kind of slight seaweedy, marine, almost kind of saline quality coming through. And certainly that kind of rich, punchy, earthy character as well. These are both Scotch whiskies. These are both peaty Scotch whiskies. They're both heavily peated Scotch whiskies, but we don't talk about ppm anymore. But why then are they different? Whiskey number 2 is Kilchoman. This is Kilchoman's newest release. No, is it? No, second newest release. They've just done 100% Islay. This is their STR cask matured whiskey. STR cask is basically it's a posh way of saying rejuvenated cask. So it's an old cask, a wine cask that's had basically been decharred and then retoasted. And it gives a much more intense oaky character and slightly more spicy characters as well. The kind of technique and the fine-tuning of the technique by the late, great Jim Swan. But what I really want to concentrate on here is the fact that Islay peat is significantly different to Highland peat. Why would that be the case? Think back 2,000 years. I don't think any of you were alive 2,000 years ago, but just imagine you were alive 2,000 years ago. What was growing on Islay? What was growing on the mainland? On the mainland, Scottish forest. On the islands, where it's quite windy and quite salty, less wood, less trees. On Orkney is a very good example. That's the other kind of great other peat area as well. No trees at all in Orkney, simply because of the weather. So the vegetation is mainly moss and heather. So Orcadian peat for like Highland Park, for example, will have this really quite distinctive, quite scented, heathery character coming through. From the central belt, or from the Highlands, you get much more of that wood smoke character that we saw in the Belechin, because there's much more lignin, so there's more tree matter in the peat, so you get much more of that distinct, actually more smoky character coming through from the mainland rather than from the islands. And where on Islay peat, as one of my great distilling mentors said to me when I was being uber geeky, and go, hey, can you please tell me, what the phenolic makeup of Islay peat is? He said, you don't need to worry, Dave, just know it's weird. So there could be marine vegetation in there, there could be some sort of saltiness going on, but when you do actually proper chemical analysis of the phenols that you get on Islay, you will notice they are different. And you do get more of that kind of tarry, creosote character. You get more of that medicinal, seaweedy character coming through as well. So it's kind of less smoky and more obviously phenolic, if that's not, doesn't seem too perverse. Do you get that? So do you see the big difference between the two? Obviously, the distillation is different, but in general, these will have been peated to roughly the same level. They will both have been, distilled in roughly the same way. But the effect is significantly different, and the effect of the smoke and the aroma of the smoke substantially different between the two. And it's at this point, it would be interesting. We don't have time, but really interesting to have a look at other Islay whiskies, because every Islay whiskey is different. The difference between Lagavulin and Caol Ila, Caol Ila, people would say, well, it's clearly slightly less smoky than Lagavulin. Yeah. Is that fair? Slightly less? They use exactly the same malt. The flavours in Caol Ila are driven by the way that they run the distillery and by the cut points. They cut slightly higher than Lagavulin. Laphroaig, when it's in full peaty mode, is really quite big and heavy and tarry. They cut very, very late. It's not fainty whiskey, but they cut very late to get these big, powerful, heavy phenols coming across. But more lower levels of peat, but cutting earlier, so you get that much more kind of fruity characters coming through. So you can really play tunes, even by using the same peat. And they're all getting peat from Portellan maltings, but you can play tunes. The Ardbeg peatiness, much more sooty for me, and you get that kind of seaweedy but sooty character. That's a mile away from Lagavulin. Lagavulin all kind of pipe smoke and bog myrtle. And that's a mile away from Lefroy, and that's different again. So you can play tunes on it. But there are substantial differences between the aromas that you get depending on the vegetation which grew there 2,000 years before. That's mad when you think of that, really. So what happens then if we then spread this around the world? So for our next 3 glasses are looking at smoke and smoked whiskies from around the world. So we've kind of established what Scotland is doing. So even in a tiny country like Scotland, you will have a number of different aromatic possibilities depending on where you're going to be cutting your peat. So what happens when you cut peat from different parts of the world? What does that give to your whiskey? So our next glass number 3, is from France, Roselier. This is one of their Fumé collections. So Roselier, I'm sure you all know, from Lorraine. Younger whiskey. So it's younger, fresher, more zippy. But the smoke for me, again, significantly different. Much kind of more lifted. This is like kind of nutty elements. It's more like kind of smoked nuts for me. There's more of a kind of malty character coming through in that, but that seems to align very nicely with the smoke itself. You certainly don't get any of that medicinal, earthy character which you're getting from the Kilchoman, and it's not that big bonfire characteristic that you're getting from the Belechin. The smoke here, slightly more discreet. Take a little taste. I like this whiskey a lot. It's got real sweetness to it. And that's an important element within a smoky whiskey. Smoke is dry. If you smoke cigars or cigarettes or whatever, your mouth is dry. You sit next to a fire, the smoke will dry you out. The most important thing in whiskey, balance. You have to have balance. So if you just have a hugely smoky whiskey without any sweetness, you have an unbalanced drink, and it's just going to dry your mouth out. So you have to have sweetness. And I think that's what you begin to look for in a smoky whiskey. So you look at where the peat appears, what the peat is like, or what the smoke is like on the palate, but at the same time, always look for sweetness, because that is what is going to make the whiskey balanced, and it's what's going to make the whiskey complex. And I think this has got, yes, the dryness coming from smoke, but it's got real beautiful sweetness to it. And actually, going back to Islay, if you taste like Ardbeg, if you stripped away all the peat from Ardbeg, incredibly sweet distillate. Lagavulin, incredibly sweet distillate beneath all of that peat. That's what's going to be giving you the balance. And here, you're at the use of the cask, smoke just hanging there, very, very gently. It kind of seems to float above the tongue. I think with the other whiskies we've had, they've kind of sat on the tongue. The smoke seemed to risen off the tongue, whereas here it just seems to be, it's like walking into a room where there's been a coal fire or a wood fire, and you just have that kind of haze of smoke just kind of lying there, above the carpet kind of thing. That's kind of the effect of the smoke that smoke has on me with the Roselier. Do you agree? Or am I just going mad? Yeah. They're just kind of, yeah, all right, we'll give you that, Dave. Yeah. So, lovely. I was told the peat actually isn't France. You're not allowed to cut peat in France. Somebody told me. I'm not sure if that's true or not. The peat probably comes from Belgium. Yeah, is that right? Cool. Somebody said yes. Yeah, cool. Yeah. Yeah, it's coming from Belgium. You tried Connemara You know, the old Cooley heavily peated stuff. You think, oh, that's great. There's lots of peat in Ireland. That peat actually comes from Wales, rather than from Ireland. Yes. So anyway, actually, just kind of going back to the whole environmental issue. The biggest problem with peat is garden centres. It's people who like gardening and put lots of peat on their garden to help their plants grow. And the peat mining firms will strip peat bogs out, just strip them out, leaving kind of bare rock, unlocking all that carbon. It's dreadful, dreadful. And that's sadly what's happened a lot in the north of England and a lot in Ireland as well. This hopefully is going to stop. But we're going to stay in Europe for our next glass. Our next glass is glass number 4, and this is Stauning. Stauning from Denmark, from the west coast of Denmark. The first distillery in Denmark. Really, it's a remarkable part of Denmark. It was like the poorest part of the country. It was this, mainly because it's just peat bogs. You know, it's peat bogs and sand dunes and wind. The houses are all kind of almost like built underground, troglodyte people, but nice people. And the distillery came here very close, actually, to where that Tolland man was found. But there's no bodies have been burnt to make the Stauning. Again, young whiskey. This is between 3 and 4 years old. A remarkable self-contained distillery, local barley. They've got their own created malting floors with just insane. It was designed by engineers, and the very first Stauning, there were just a bunch of mad Danes who wanted to make whiskey. They just fell in love with whiskey, and they went, well, we can make this because, you know, we understand problems. We can do this as well. We love Ardbeg, so we're going to make kind of big kind of Ardbeggy thing. We don't have a distillery, but the father of 2 of the guys was the town butcher, and he had a kind of butchery out the back of the house. So initially, they used all kind of butchery equipment to make their whiskey. You know, so like barbecues and you name it. Actually, a meat grinder. They used a meat grinder instead of a mill. And then they moved to a distillery. They've now built a substantially bigger distillery as well. So still using peat for some of their whiskey, not all of their whiskey. Still using direct fire as well. So it's this really fascinating mix of kind of old ideas and very new problem-solving ideas as well. Wonderfully energy efficient as well. And if you go around that part of Western Denmark, there's a huge amount of heather. So it's like Orkney, but very sandy soil, not a huge amount of vegetation. So it's kind of grasses, marram grass, heather, and I think that comes across here as well. They do make a very small amount of heather smoked whiskey as well, but heather is very difficult to do because heather just likes to go on fire rather than smolder. So I've just pulled the hair out. So I think you get this much more lifted, more aromatic character coming through here. Little kind of grassy, vegetal thing coming as well. Very fresh. They make a very fresh, sweet whiskey. Again, as I said, young. It's a new distillery, so it's a young whiskey. And the nature of that smoke, just totally different once more. Why? Because the conditions dictated that only certain plants would grow there, and that, over 1,000 years, has given you a different aromatic framework or aromatic palette. What do you think of the Stauning? Yeah? Yeah, it's delicious. Really watch out for this distillery. 48.4%. Yeah, really watch out for them. They are going big places. That new distillery is immense. You know, they put in, they started off with one tiny still that they used twice. Then the first distillery they had four pots. They now have 22 pots, all direct fired. You know, it's yes, extraordinary place. So there you have. We've had 4 peaty whiskies, but 4 substantially different effects. that this apparently very, very simple fuel is giving. So peat being a significant contributor to balance and to complexity, to flavor characteristic. So, just before we finish, we'll move on to our final whiskey. Our final whiskey is different again. You'll probably be able to see that from the color. Really kind of almost kind of orangey or deep amber color. The nose is different once more. Not kind of touch of spice in there, and a subtle smoke. Smoke isn't hugely apparent, but the smoke is there. And certainly when you taste it, I began talking into my glass and tried to drink my microphone. It's been a long day, you know. When you taste it, I think the smoke really develops on the palate. I'll tell you a little bit about this in a second. So just have a little taste of this. Kind of candied sweetness. Again, slight heat. This is sitting here at diddly-diddly-dee. It's strong. 47.8, so yeah, just under there. Little touches of spice coming through, kind of baking spices in the end. Nice kind of apple element, and that smoke just coming through. Quite, and kind of red fruit elements beginning to develop as well. Beautifully balanced. Again, it's got that sweetness. But this doesn't use peat. So as you can probably see, because they've written it very large letters, this is from California. This is from Sonoma. This is Sonoma Distilling Company. This is their Wood Rye. The mash bill being 80% rye from California and Canada, for those of you who are interested, 10% Californian wheat, and 10% cherry wood smoked malted barley. So the smoke element is actually a very, very small percentage of the overall mash bill, but you can still getting it through. And I think it does give you that wonderful, really quite gentle red fruit characteristic coming through. I think this is absolutely delicious, delicious, delicious whiskey. And it just shows, what do you think of this one? Yeah, it's good. It's really good, isn't it? It's a cracker. Have you got this in Australia yet? I think you should. That lovely, spicy, quite kind of dark fruits in there as well. It's not one I often describe rye as being a bit like Clint Eastwood walking into a bar in a western. You know, like boom, rye is here. This is a much more kind of discreet, slightly sweeter, more fruit-driven rye. Really, really beautifully made. I think that cherry wood smoke just comes through just enough. Because you don't have to use peat. If you don't have peat anywhere near you, why import peated barley? Why not use what grows around you? And that's what distillers do. You know, that's why Scotland makes whiskey, because barley grows in Scotland. It's why brandy is made in France, because grapes are grown here. It's why mezcal is made, because agave grows in Mexico. You know, distillers use what grows around them, and the same applies to smokes. And it's interesting, sort of looking at the way that distillers are now beginning to approach it, that they're thinking, oh yeah, I want to make a smoky whiskey because we kind of go full circle because people really like smoke. Right, do I import some peat, or do I look at food tradition? Do I look at the way in which our foods have been smoked as a preservative over the years? So a whole number of distillers all around the world are beginning to do that, and a lot of wood smoke is beginning to be used, especially in America. A distillery called Corsair. I don't know if you've heard of Corsair. They've got one distillery in Tennessee, one in Kentucky, run by a guy called Derek Bell, who's just this mad innovator. I love what he does, but I wish he would just settle down to make one whiskey, but he's always trying to do different things. You know, he's distilled every cereal known to man, and he has burned every wood known to man as well, just to see what the effect would be on the whiskey. So a lot of wood smoke coming out. Texas, a lot of kind of Balcones brimstone, a good example of that. Mesquite flavored, different kind of oaks. chestnut being used in Germany, some chestnut being used in France as well. Nettles being used in a distillery in Denmark called Fairy Lochen. Nettles smoked nettles being used to smoke and scent the local cheese. So again, it's coming directly from food tradition. And probably the most extreme of the lot, sheep dung in Iceland. Yeah, and you know, it smells like you would expect, really. Again, traditional. They're kind of calming it down a little bit. The sheep dung smoke goes quite a long way. But yeah, so all around the world, people are addressing this issue of, yes, consumers love smoke, but we don't have peat, but we can use all these different areas. So it is, for me, just another element in this remarkable evolution that whiskey has taken over the past few years. That, yeah, sorry, I'll get the question in a sec. Finish this rant. When I started writing, I'm an old man, clearly. You know, when I first started writing about whiskey, there were no whiskey distilleries in England. I think there was maybe one in France, and there were 70 operational in Scotland. As of the end of this year, there will be 140 distilleries operational in Scotland. There will be 100 distilleries making whiskey in France. You know, and that is in the space of just a few years. You know, a decade at most. We are living through the most extraordinary exploration of what whiskey is that we have ever seen. We're in a golden age of whiskey, and smoke is just one of the questions that distillers all around the world are asking. Yeah, sorry.
I was wondering, when you speak about cherry wood smoke,
yeah,
is that also the phenolic components that you showed earlier that are playing a role, or is that different type of chemical components?
I honestly would know, not being a scientist, but I would hazard a guess that you will find some phenolic components within there, but you won't find others. So you won't find creosol, for example. You know, so there's some which you will only find in peat, and you'll probably find only some. You know, the peat on Islay, the chemical composition is going to be different again. So yeah, the honest answer is I don't know, but my educated guess would be there'd be some of them in there, but there would be other components as well. Certainly different aromatic compounds, because the smell is completely different. Sorry, Ian, you were going to say.
Thank you. I think the nose on the empty Sonoma glass is just fantastic. The smoke from that empty glass is great.
Anyway. There's a true Scotsman. You know, he scalped that glass really quickly. You know, I've still got some left.
As you do. The basis of my question is I find it, I can't understand why some peaty whiskies have a lot of peaty, earthy flavour on the tongue, but no smoke, and others have both, and some have more smoke than the earthy, you know, the different phenolic compounds. I mean, the great Octomore is a great example. It's all peat on the tongue, but very little smoke.
Yes. Yeah.
Why is that?
I would say that, I mean, the answer to that is, I think it lies within that the nature of the phenols. I mean, the phenols are driving a certain element within the whiskey itself. But there are obviously a huge number of other different compounds, other flavour compounds, which will be interacting with those phenols. Also, the cut point. The cut point is going to be really important. You know, although Octomore is heavily peated barley, the cut point is still relatively high. You know, so you're actually missing out a lot of those compounds which will give you that more kind of earthy, smoky characteristic. So you're only getting some of them. You're getting some of the more fragrant ones coming through. So I reckon that might be, that might well be the answer. Again, an educated guess. You know, I am not a scientist. I was not allowed to take chemistry at school for fear of bringing disgrace upon the establishment. You know, so me talking about phenols is a ridiculous thing. Yes.
Just about the Octomore. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the peat and the peated barley for Brooklady distillery is not from Ireland.
It's not from Ireland.
mainland.
That's correct.
Maybe
Yeah.
it can explain
the nature, which is why you often get more kind of wood smoke rather than getting that kind of saline stuff. Yeah, it's all coming from Baird's up in Inverness. Yeah. Good point. Is that it? Any other questions? In which case, my friends, thank you so much for sparing time, because I know there's some amazing whiskies through there, and rums, amazing rums through there as well. Thanks very much for having me. I enjoy the rest of the show. Thank you.